we're going to talk about converting between decimals, fractions, and percents. So first we're going to look at if we have a fraction, how we'd convert it to a decimal or a percent. So converting to a decimal, well, if we think about fractions, this fraction bar really means division. So it means that I'm dividing my numerator by my denominator, which is what I'm going to do. It is okay to divide a smaller number by a bigger number. So our numerator goes on the inside, the denominator goes on the outside. So 4 goes into 1 0 times. I'm going to bring that decimal point directly above the decimal in the dividend. It goes into 10 twice. Multiply. 4 times 2 is 8. Subtract. 10 minus 8 is 2. Bring down our 0. 4 goes into 20 5 times. 4 times 5 is 20. When we subtract, we get a remainder of 0. So the equivalent decimal for 1/4 is 0.25. And if you think about it, a quarter would be a fourth, and that's worth 25 cents. Now let's look at converting a fraction to a percent. Well, we looked at this in our last unit. Anytime we're doing a percent problem, we can use a percent proportion. Okay? So remember, it's always the part over the whole equals the percent out of 100. And we're converting it to a percent, which means we're solving for the percent every time. Well, our numerators are part, our denominators are whole, and we solve this proportion. The two numbers that are diagonal from each other are 7 and 100. So 7 times 100 equals 700. And then we divide by the number opposite the variable, or the same diagonal as the variable, divide by 25, and you should get an answer of 28. And we're talking about percent, so I'm going to put a percent sign there. Now we're going to look at, if we have a decimal, how we convert it to a fraction into a percent. So if I'm converting a decimal to a fraction, this is where place value comes in handy. So we got to determine what place value the decimal ends in. Then we're going to write the decimal number as a fraction over that place value and simplify that fraction. So if I'm looking at this decimal here, the 5 is in the tens place, the 6 is in the hundredths place. So the place value of this decimal is the hundredths, because that's where it ends. So that was our first step. We determined what the place value it ends in. Second step, we're going to write the decimal number as a fraction over that place value. So we have our decimal number of 56, and we're going to write it as in a fraction over the place value. Well, the place value that it ended in was hundredths, so it's 56 out of 100. And now we need to simplify. This is where your factor chart would come in handy. Look for that greatest common factor to divide by. I could just find common factors. It's going to be easiest if you can find the greatest common factor. So, if I look for that greatest common factor on my factor chart, I realize these divide by 4. 56 divided by 4 is 14, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. That is our simplified fraction. Converting a decimal to a percent. This should be a little bit easier, a little less math. We're just looking at our decimal values. So the first step is to move the decimal 2 places to the right. So I've got a decimal right here. I'm going to move it once, twice. So the new decimal goes at the end here. This decimal doesn't matter anymore. And then we add a percent sign. So we've got 54%. Same thing here, we move our decimal 2 places to the right. So once, twice, our new decimal goes here. That decimal's no more, so we have 143%. And then over here, move our decimal twice to the right. Once, twice, the new decimal goes in between that 3 and that 5. That decimal is no more. These zeros in front don't really matter. 0, 0, 3 is just 3. So I write this as 3 and 5/10, or 3.5, and add the percent sign. And we've got 3.5%. And the last part, looking at if you're given a percent, how we convert that to a fraction and a decimal. So percent to a fraction. Well, if we think about percentage is always out of 100%, right? If you think about a test, you're looking at what grade you got out of 100. So we're going to write this as a fraction, always over 100%. So if we have 32%, it's 32 over 100. And just like we did above, we're going to simplify. So I'm going to use my factor chart to figure out what they both divide by. Well, I know they're even, so I could divide that way. But if I look at my factor chart, I realize they can divide by 4. 32 divided by 4 is 8. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So our simplified fraction is 8 over 25. Then, percent to decimal. So the first step is I'm going to add a decimal in place of the percent sign, and then I'm going to move that decimal place. So basically I'm getting rid of the percent signs and I'm adding a decimal. So we have 48 with a decimal. We have 137 with a decimal where the percent was. We have 6 with a decimal where the percent was. Up above, when we turned a decimal to a percent, we moved the decimal point to the right. But now we're doing the reverse, a percent to a decimal, so we're going to move our decimal to the left. So I'm going to take my decimal point, move it once, twice. My new decimal goes to the left there. So I'm going to write that properly. We have 0 wholes and 48 hundredths. Here I'm going to take that decimal, move it once, twice. It's going to go in between the 1 and the 3. And that old decimal doesn't matter. So we've got 1 and 37 hundredths. And then this is tricky. This is where people sometimes make mistakes. So I'm going to move my decimal once, twice. There's no number here. So I'm going to fill it in with a 0, and my decimal goes on the left there. So I have 0.06. Sometimes you're going to have to use all of these different conversions, but sometimes you're going to choose which option is the best to convert to. A lot of times I think it's easy to convert to decimals because fractions can be a little bit harder to work with, but that's up to you. Now what I'd like you to do is answer these questions on the back and get your answers checked.